Hey everybody, it's Diamond, and today I'm going to talk you through my Ableton Live Doom bass synthesizer simulation. If you've played the new Doom games, you'll know that in the soundtrack there is this massive bass synthesizer sound it's wildly chaotic and distorted and layered with feedback. It's a really unique sound and not one that I've heard in any other musical project or band. I've done my best to recreate it, having admired it ever since I first heard the soundtrack. This is what my replica sounds like. Yeah, that's it. Nothing too fancy note-wise, but the sound is incredible, if I do say so myself. It sounds, if you'll notice, very similar to the actual bass sound from the Doom soundtracks. As you can see, it sounds very similar. So, how did I do this in Ableton Live, and how can you do it too? Well, when I went into this to try and make that sound, I honestly had no clue what I was doing or how I was going to do it, but for my bass line, I ripped off the setup of Mick Gordon, who composed the Doom Eternal and Doom 2016 soundtracks. He described his setup in detail in a GDC video, so I was able to recreate that in Ableton Live with a digital-only model. So, what Mick Gordon did for the Doom soundtracks is he fed a pure sine wave through multiple layers of analog audio effects, did some wizardry with compressors and feedback, and then fed the whole processed signal through a crappy 30-watt practice amp, and then recorded that with a crappy mic, and then EQ'd the recording to boost the bass massively. Ridiculously complicated process, but he arrived at a cool sound, so I set about recreating that in live. One thing before I start, there will be no use of the crappy practice amp because I could not figure out how to EQ the recording properly and get that low end to be massive enough. It may have something to do with the fact that all of my mics are super shit, but anyway, to the instrument itself. So here we have the sine wave, the bass sine wave that we need. That's simple enough. I've got a wavetable synth here to do the sine wave thing. Wavetable is my favorite live synthesizer. I don't use any of the others. Of course, I use the others. I just don't know how they work. So I've got a basic sub bass line. It's nothing too special. It's not very complicated at all note-wise. Got a bit of a pitch envelope to add a nice attack, a vinyl distortion right here to make a constant ambient noise. I'll talk more about that later. So there's the sine wave. Now, what we have next are 3 separate effect chains. I just took every sound-destroying effect that I could find in live. Thankfully, it comes with some really awesome ones right out of the box that could be used for just about anything you can imagine. And I just threw them randomly onto 3 different tracks right here in the middle. This is just a bunch of different distortion effects. Got a guitar pedal sim here, tube sim, standard overdrive, more vinyl distortion. I can't remember why I put that there, but it's obviously automated, so it must be useful. A phaser. The effect of that's not really noticeable, but it creates a nice hollow kind of sound. Utility, just to duck the gain a little bit so that nothing gets too overloaded. I mean, overloading is a good thing in this case. We want it to sound as distorted as possible, but too much overloading is not good for anything. And then finally, you have a compressor to even everything out a little bit, make the volume nice and equal. Here's the amp channel, the amp sim channel, heavy amp sim, cabinet, another utility to duck the gain, another compressor to even things out, wave shaping channel, got a wave shaper. This one may be the most noticeable out of all the effects. It adds some really nasty distortion that can be easily heard over everything else. It's got a really unique characteristic to it. Got a flanger here that gives it another kind of hollow type of quality. And on the very end here, we've got a bit crusher. I don't know why I bothered putting that after the compressor, but anyway, it's automated. Get some nice lo-fi tones in there. And then, of course, this one also has a compressor to even things out a little bit. So obviously they all have compressors on them, but you'll notice also that the side chain is enabled on each of the compressors, and these three tracks full of effects right here are side chaining each other. Now this is something that Mick Gordon did with the soundtracks of the Doom games. He had the effect arrays all side chain each other to create a constantly dynamically changing output based on the input. So this way, if it's not all of the three chains, it's not all of their signals just added together. So if one gets louder than the other, it'll be brought up in the mix while the other stuff is ducked instead of just adding it all together and making a big mush of sound. So you'll also notice too that a bunch of these parameters on these effects are automated without any rhyme or reason whatsoever. They're just automated incredibly randomly. That is on purpose, although a few of these parameters have a bit of structures to the automation, but most of them are just automated really randomly, and that's where the chaos in the sound comes from. Certain parameters make more of a noticeable change in the sound, but if you just automate everything, that's basically what you want to do to get the best sound. So there we have all the processing that goes on in the sine wave to make it just the gnarliest sound possible. But next we need the feedback, which is going to create those really dirty industrial artifacts whenever the sine wave is not being fed into the entire array. So to create the feedback, I did a lot of routing experiments. I'm terrible at routing audio and live. Maybe that's just because I've never tried to do it before, or, well, at least, of course, I've routed audio and live before. I've just never tried to do it to purposefully create feedback. And to create feedback in the way that I wanted to in order to create this bass sound, I had no clue how to do it. So I just experimented until I found something that kind of worked. There might have been an easier way to arrive at it, but this is what I did. So right here, this one at the top, this is kind of a splitter of sorts, if you will. It receives the pure sine wave from the wavetable, and these three tracks right here all receive that sine wave, and that sine wave is processed through each track's effect chain. One of these effect tracks outputs to this track right here, the feedback gen track, as I called it. I'm not sure why I chose this one to output to the feedback gen track. Maybe it's because I couldn't get the right sound with any of the other tracks. But anyway, yeah. So then the feedback gen receives that signal outputted from one of the effect tracks. And this one is, it's kind of, the feedback gen track is kind of like a fake master track. We have yet another utility here to tame the high levels a little bit. Another compressor to kind of like be a master compressor to even everything out even more and just squish everything into oblivion. And we also have a filter with an LFO on it. I'll explain more about that in a little bit. So after everything gets sent from the wavetable to the splitter track, to the effects tracks, to the feedback gen track, then it all goes back to the splitter track. So we've got a nice little feedback loop here, and if we turn the whole thing on, then we get really gnarly feedback whenever there's not a sine wave being fed through the whole array. Super gnarly stuff. It's awesome. So yeah, the fake master track sends audio back to the splitter track, and since there is a vinyl distortion on the sine wave track, it's constantly generating ambient noise, and that's what's causing the feedback when the sine wave's not being fed into the whole thing. Now, if this were Mick Gordon's setup, then the feedback would be generated by the ground hum from within the array, but since this is a digital-only recreation of the bass synth, there is no ground hum, so we kind of have to make our own ground hum substitute. This auto filter with the LFO right here, this adds variety to the feedback, changes the tone of it by changing the frequency with the LFO. I'm not sure exactly how, but somehow the slowly moving filter frequency changes the tone of the feedback. So like if you turn this on, you can hear the tone of the feedback is being changed, so it's being randomized a little bit. Now, if you turn off the LFO or just turn off the filter, then you still get the feedback, but it's kind of samey. It's the same tone, just slightly varied. So I actually automated that. Here's a place where there's no filter LFO. So like I said, if you turn off the filter with the LFO, you still get feedback, but it's just that same feedback tone with maybe a little bit of variation here. And it is turning that off to just get that one feedback tone is desirable at certain points, because if you do turn off the filter LFO, I'm not sure why, but it adds an extra layer of grittiness to the bass sound. So let me demonstrate that. It adds kind of a bit of a gritty tone, a little bit more of a dirty tone to the bass. So that's why I automated the filter on and off, so that I could get that dirty tone at certain points. And also the same feedback tone over and over again, because sometimes that actually is desirable. Now, all this stuff about the automation having to do with the tone of the bass changing, but the tone of the bass also changes if the amplitude of the sine wave changes. But the volume that's coming out of the array stays pretty much the same, because everything's been squashed into oblivion with compressors. So this means that you can do some really interesting stuff if you manipulate the amp envelope right. So right now, you can see I've got the sustain level for the amp envelope on the sine wave automated. So right here, it's all the way up. So you just get a sine wave that's the same volume into infinity. But right here, it decays fairly quickly. So as the volume of the note fades out, the artifacts and feedback that are being generated by the vinyl distortion, those ambient noises start to be brought up in the mix more, and it can sound really interesting. But if you want a more consistent sound, then you can just crank up the sustain to max and get a more steady sound that's not as, it doesn't decay into feedback as easily. There's also a slight bit of release time. You'll notice if I zoom in here, all of the notes, the notes don't bump into each other. And I did that on purpose so that I could take advantage of the release time to have the sine wave decay away rapidly and bring up that feedback at the same time. So by controlling the release time, controlling the sustain volume, controlling the amount of distance between notes, and by changing the filter on and off and LFO rate and frequency and all that, I can pretty much manipulate the feedback however I want. And of course, we have tons and tons and tons of parameters to automate right here to change the tone of the synthesizer if we want to change the actual tone of the bass. So we've got all that too. Now, the master track actually does have some use. As you can see, there's another filter on this one to tame some unwanted high frequencies. Why did I have this automated? Oh yeah, I made a dropout right here, kind of a swell. I don't know what you'd call it, but anyway, yeah. So there's another utility here. Lots and lots and lots of high levels being tamed. Lots of high levels need to be tamed. The reverb's just there to add a little bit of space to everything. Oh yeah, I also made the output signal from everything mono with the utility. I don't know why this bass sound works. It works the best if there's not a very wide stereo image and like some reverb on it, just a little bit of reverb. That's the way it sounds the best. Don't ask me why. Just maybe it's that's just the way it sounds the best to me. So when you put all that crap together, sine wave, feedback loop, distortion all over the place, tons of automation, filters, and all that baloney, you get the Doom bass synthesizer. And it sounds pretty close to the original for a replica that's digital only and made with only Ableton Live stock effects. Well, I think that's about all I have to say. I hope you found this video informative. If you did, then make sure to subscribe, like, share, and check out my other videos. Hope that you've learned enough so that you can maybe try to recreate this sound for yourself, not just in Live, but in whatever software you have. As always, thanks for watching. Until next time, fanboys, Diamond out.